Hello, I'm Kat Farrance, and I'm a disembodied voice who doesn't quite have a video working. And today I am introducing Lucy Parker and Ben Parker, who are who are founders of Flow in Tunbridge Wells. How are you both?
We're really good, Kat, and it's a shame you're a disembodied voice, but at least we know what you look like, so we can visualise you in your glory.
Yeah, or not, as the case may be. Now, today's really rather a special session because Lucy, you two are a pretty incredible team for all things bodies. Yeah, because Lucy, you're a yoga teacher and an incredible one at that, and Ben is an osteopath. So this is a really amazing opportunity for us and our lucky community to be able to ask questions of you guys. So I know that there have been loads of lovely questions lined up, and I also have a few of my own, which I might spring on you if there is time, because there's always more questions. And we've got lots of hellos.
Hello, it was lovely to see you, friends. Sonia and Sean and Alicia and Neelam. Thank you for joining us today. And I was just thinking what a joy it is that obviously Ben and I are married, so even though we're in lockdown, we're allowed to be sitting next to each other. So just in case anyone was worried, we're allowed to be close.
Good. Unlike me, I am remote like everybody else in their homes. Do you want to just get started and start rattling through the questions, you guys, because there is a lot of ground to cover.
Yes, I wondered if we should start with the hips, because we noticed that we had 3 hip-related questions, and we thought that would be quite good to start with the hips, because obviously people have been using their hips a lot in the yoga classes. There's a lot of work in yoga with the hips, and I think that it's probably quite useful for us to go through those initially. So Ben, the first quick question we had actually from Shona was talking about butterfly pose. So I think we would think of that as cobbler's pose. So sitting with your feet together, knees wide, and this issue that Shona has where she feels that her knees often stay quite high, and is this something that over time will change, or is this something that she's kind of got to in some way embrace as her physical and personal anatomy? And I think that's a really good question for us to start with.
Absolutely, yeah. So hips and the pelvis are a really key area of the body where there's loads of variability, not just between men and women, but also between just individuals in general. And this will really influence how hips are able to move or perhaps be hindered from moving. If we had a quick look at
a variety of hips here for you, for us to be able to show you.
Yeah, so we've got a hip here on the skeleton, and you can see that there's a really decent ball and socket. Hopefully you can see that on the image here. This is the ball of the femur going into the socket of the pelvis. So this is the ball and socket joint. But what you can notice about the femur is that this is this angle of the neck of the femur coming down here. So it travels up and inwards into the hip. Now this can be quite varied in terms of the angle, and it actually changes over our lifetime. So when we're babies, it starts quite steep, and then as gravity gradually forces it downwards over time, it does actually drop. But also, if Lucy, could you grab me? I'll grab it actually.
We like our props here. We like
it's an angle. Yes.
He's just taking somebody's leg off, which really shouldn't be allowed, but it's okay.
That's right. So if I was to look from the top, you can see that there's also this angle of the ball heading upwards as it goes inwards towards the femur. So it's angled in this direction, but it's also angled in this direction. Now this can be quite varied actually. So in some people, the hip will be slightly more turned inwards, and in other people it will be slightly more turned outwards. And there's several fancy medical names for this, but I'm not going to get bogged down in that. Just want to give you the idea that there's lots of variability, and that's going to potentially influence the sort of starting point. So if your hip is already a bit turned in, it might be quite tricky for it to then go into that full sort of external rotation when you're in cobbler's pose. So in answer to the question, it could well be that the hips just don't want to or aren't fully able to externally rotate, but they might be really, really good at the opposite angle, so internal rotation. So often I'll see even that one leg will be favour one over the other, so one hip might go very nicely into that external rotation, into the cobbler's pose type position, whereas the other might be quite restricted. So it would be interesting, as always, to know a bit more detail about this. We are flying slightly blind in terms of actually what might be causing the problem, and as we've said, highlighted, this is general advice that we're giving, some ideas, and it's certainly not specific. So Shona might want to actually, get someone to have a proper look at the hips, someone like myself or another physical therapist, to see if that might be the case. There might be an anatomical reason for this. But clearly as well, there's all the musculature around that hip area that could be causing the restriction as well. In particular, our groin muscles and what we call the adductor muscles. So adduction of the hip would be to bring the knee in towards the centre of the body. So if they're very tight, they're not going to allow that opening up, that abduction and external rotation type manoeuvre.
Gosh, that was all so speedily done. I quite like doing a little bit of a shortcut on this. So if you hold your arm up and you kind of make a fist, and then you tip the fist a little bit down, this is very much like the shape of your ball and socket of your hip. So the ball and socket is like the fist, your wrist is like the neck, and the arm is obviously the leg bone. So you have these two legs. And actually it is very possible, just as Ben said, for the femur head to insert into the pelvis in slightly different ways with both legs, and in slightly different ways in terms of that neck of the femur. So I guess the answer to this question is one of the rules that we have, which is there is no one way, there's no specific thing. It might be possible that there is something muscular, but your question here does suggest that actually it's probably something more anatomical, and to celebrate that as personal and individual to you. So I hope that helped with that question. Just number one of
we'll move on. But just in terms of that idea of, is it worth trying to sort of work into that restriction? And certainly, yes, it is, even if there's a point at which you kind of just get to where it doesn't seem to make any significant improvement. The fact is that you've then certainly got to your full range of movement and are able to maintain that. And the question also talks about the hamstrings. Hamstrings on some people just seem to be perennially tight, so definitely worth just challenging that lengthening process. So don't back off just because we're saying it's anatomical. Do work within your limits.
And I'm seeing lots of people's names pop up here, so it's really lovely to see Anna and Greta and lots of people that we know and have worked with in the past, or are teachers, so really thrilling to see you all. So still sticking with our theme of the hip. So one thing, particularly if you're a teacher, please be aware that the hips are separate to the pelvis and the pelvis separate to the hips. Of course, they work together, but it's really important to think about that hip joint as a separate thing to the whole of the collective, the pelvis. And we talk a lot about that in our advanced anatomy course, so it's worth you kind of keeping that in your mind. So the next hip question, which is so relevant to now, is Kathy, who's been in lockdown and shielding. And Kathy said that because she's been in lockdown, she's been shielding, she's been sitting in a chair a lot. And I noticed in the chat here, somebody said they've been sitting in a chair for about 10 hours. And yes, this is going to have an impact on your hips and on your back. We are born to move, which is probably why Kat has come up with Movement for Modern Life and the Movers Group. We're born to move. So really sitting statically it's just not going to be helpful. Getting up and moving, really, yes, moving in terms of yoga, great, but just simply getting up and moving is going to help. So back to Kathy's question, she's been sitting in her chair, and the outer right hip is getting quite painful for her, and she's talked about the fact that if she then goes onto her mat and tries to practice yoga and sits cross-legged, that can become really uncomfortable for her. So yes, what should Kathy do with this outer right hip problem from sitting? Apart from, please Kathy, get up and walk around your house, move.
Yeah.
But apart from that, what else might Kathy be thinking that could be this problem? It's interesting, it's just one hip and not both.
Yeah, so I certainly at the moment as an osteopath seeing a lot of people who have been had to transition very quickly to home working, and maybe the workstation setup isn't quite right. So with the one hip, I'm thinking maybe there's something about the workstation that might be a bit asymmetric or twisted, or there might be an habitual sort of pattern of sitting that crossing the legs in one particular way, or something along those lines. So do have to think about that, but hopefully you've kind of covered those bases already. So the two kind of things.
Sorry, I'm just going to interrupt, which is what I do. Whenever you sit on your chair at home to work, please make sure that your feet can touch the ground. It seems very obvious, and if your legs are long and your feet touch the ground, you will never think about that. But if your legs are a little shorter or your chair's a little higher, it's really important you set up your workstation so that you can have a really comfortable place to sit and your feet can find the floor, even if that means you have to bring the floor to your feet by putting a stack of books or some bricks or blocks or something under your feet so you feel stable. And we're now working from home, so many of us need to really consider how we're doing that and how comfortable we can make our bodies. Sorry for that interruption.
It's a good point. So the two things I'm thinking of, that it could well just be a muscular issue on the outside of our buttock glute area. We've got a muscle called gluteus medius, which can get very tight and certainly can get a bit overworked with sort of static postures like this. So I might be thinking in terms of some perhaps some stretching if it's a muscular problem. But I did want to just flag up that there's another condition to do with bursitis. So bursa are these small, not necessarily small, they're fluid-filled sacs that are in areas of the body where there might be some chafing. So we have the IT band that quite a lot of people have heard of, so this long tapering tendon that goes down the side of the thigh, and that actually goes over this bony lump here. So it's coming up from the knee and travelling across to its muscular attachments through some through the main gluteal muscle, gluteus maximus, and another muscle called tensor fasciae lata up here. So if these muscles are getting quite tight, they could cause some chafing of the iliotibial band across that bony lump of the femur here called the greater trochanter. So our bodies have positioned a bursa there that helps to reduce that friction. So a bursa, as I said, has got the fluid inside it, but it shouldn't have very much fluid. It's akin to, like, if you've got a carrier bag, a plastic carrier bag, you put a little bit of water in it, it would be nicely slippy. But if you put loads of water in it, it would be quite sort of cumbersome and get in the way. And that's what happens when a bursitis occurs. So anything with itis on the end suggests inflammation. So that bursa will swell up and become quite painful. The only reason I'm thinking that is because if you're feeling that pain when you're sitting cross-legged, I wonder if there's a bit of compression going on in that bursa. Again, this is just thinking off the top of my head in many ways, and obviously it would be great to get a bit more detail or hands-on assessment is definitely the best option.
But would you suggest that Kathy goes and gets that looked at?
I think if it's causing enough problems, then it's always good to get these things assessed properly. But just to give you some ideas, the reason I'm making this distinction between a muscular problem solely and a bursitis type problem is because you might want to treat them slightly differently. Because if you start stretching those side muscles of the hip, like gluteus medius, gluteus maximus, and tensor fasciae lata, that I mentioned already, yeah, and there's a bursitis there, it might make it more inflamed. So definitely worth having a think about that. Stretching for those gluteal muscles, what would you suggest?
So, Kathy, I would suggest that there's lots of postures that you can do sitting in your chair, actually. So if there is a reason why you're not able to get up and walk around and you need to stay in your chair, there are things you can do in your chair. So there's a pigeon pose you could do sitting. I'm not sitting in a chair right now, but we've got a chair here in case we felt like we had to sort of jump on impulse onto the chair. But if you imagine, you could try a little kind of type of a pigeon pose, if you know that pose, sitting. So you're placing one leg onto the other knee on the chair. You could create some little stretches there. Obviously doing both sides, even though there might be this discomfort on one side, kind of even yourself out a little bit. Do practice with both sides. And then even just kind of chair knee hugs or sitting on the chair and resting one leg down by the side. So I think we probably need to move on from here, but there are many things that you could do still sitting on that chair. But I think the main thing is, if it is a bursitis, potentially try and get that checked out, that swelling, and find some way of moving to stop this static. And actually, we've had another question from Laura here saying that, is it very common to have wonky hips? I think just to sort of answer that question, I wouldn't personally necessarily say it's very common, but it is very possible to have completely different hips. I mean, you mentioned here, Laura, that you have one that's much more open to the side, and you notice it in different postures. So yes, it is certainly possible that that is just due to the insertion points of the femur head into your pelvis, and maybe that's something that you grow to love about yourself, you know, rather than that sort of desire that often bubbles out to be a bit kind of challenging or competitive. So I hope that helps. Sticking with the hips, we had another question in advance for, I hope I pronounce your name correctly, Urzi. Urzi, I hope I pronounced your name correctly there. But you're saying that you have tightness in your inner right hip, and you feel that it could be your hip flexors feel impinged. Both Ben and I stopped at that point and went, I wonder what you mean by that. So you feel that your hip flexors may feel impinged. And you mentioned here about muscular attachments around the hip there and what potentially could be loosened up. So you're an occupational therapist, and I apologise if I pronounced your name incorrectly. I hope I haven't. So Ben.
Yeah, so the tightness is around that area could make it feel something like an impingement. I think both of us sort of flagged that up because there is a condition called hip impingement, which is much more to do with the bony anatomy of the hip, so that two portions of the hip joint are getting butted up against each other when they shouldn't. So, for example, if the socket has got a bit more of a lip around, a bony lip around the socket, it might actually start to butt up against the femur in certain positions, and likewise there might be extra bone laid down around the neck of the femur, which might again get in the way. So if that's the case, it tends to cause a pain that's quite strong, particularly when you're lying on your back and you're taking the leg across your body, but taking the hip across in this sort of direction, so you're compressing into that front of the hip. If that's giving you quite a distinct pain that you want to kind of get away from, again, it might be worth getting that looked at. But the other possibility is tight hip flexors. One of the main things that might indicate that is if you have a tendency for your pelvis to want to roll forwards when you're standing upright, because the tightness, the shortness of the hip flexors will literally pull the bowl of the pelvis forward. So if you've got that sort of tightness through the hip flexors, as I say, you might want to look at some postural indicators of that.
Yeah, I've managed to make our screen really big, which means I can't see anything. I don't know.
Okay.
Yes, just a little technical thing. So hopefully that's helpful. Greta mentioned one of our wonderful teachers. Greta's just a little comment on, Ben's fixed it, about potentially a ball under, so lying on your back, maybe putting a ball under the buttock. Could be good, but of course there are very, very different types of firmness of ball. So I don't recommend a golf ball. You know, maybe even a tennis ball would be a bit much, or something kind of soft. Build up to that. Yeah, thank you for that.
I think part of this question as well was just to talk a little about the muscular attachments around the hip area, which obviously there are lots. So if we focus just on the muscles around the front of the hip joint, then we could certainly identify a muscle called iliacus, which attaches to the inside of the bowl of the pelvis into this area, and then comes forward over the brim of the bowl of the pelvis to attach onto this little knoll of bone here, which I'm not sure if you'll be able to see, but there's a slight prominence there, which is where this iliacus muscle. So this is your iliac crest, and so the muscle is called iliacus. And that's one of our primary hip flexors. It actually is joined by our psoas muscle, which has its attachments much higher up into the lumbar spine, onto these little processes coming out the side of the spine, the transverse processes. That's actually, in my mind, much more of a core stabilizing muscle than a hip flexor. But I know that there are a lot of people who do consider that to be a prime hip flexor. I think iliacus is more prominent. We also have one of the quadricep muscles that attaches just below this bony knoll at the front of the pelvis here, and then comes down to the front of the thigh. And that's definitely a hip flexor. So if these muscles around here are quite tight, that could cause problems of a pinching type sensation, certainly. But then we have all of our adductor muscles, our groin muscles that attach around the pubic bone here, and then around the rest of the pelvic bones at the front of the pelvis here, and then come down in various angles to the femur. So this is part of the pelvis called ischium. This is our ischial tuberosity, our sitting bones. So hopefully that gives you a very much of a whistle-stop tour around the front of the muscles around the front of the hip. But anyway,
I think one of the other principles that we talk about a lot in our trainings is a principle that Ben and I both feel really, really passionate about, and it's the principle of the biopsychosocial model. So we all have a biology, we all have a psychology, and we all have a social setup. And so many of these things that potentially might feel that they're anatomical might also be psychological. They might also be to do with the chair that you're sitting on, or other kind of just your environment. And this is really, really powerful for us to, as yoga teachers, take on board. So when we're looking at somebody sitting in butterfly hips, you know, it might not be as simple as what's happening with their musculature, what's happening with their anatomy, but something that could be more based on something psychological, something else. And that biopsychosocial model is something we work with a lot, along with this concept of no one way. Thank you so much, Erski. Again, I hope I pronounced your name right, but really nice that that's been useful for you, and that it is the sitting cross-legged that causes that sensation. And Natalie, I'm pleased that was useful. Oh, here we go, hypermobility. Yeah, so hypermobility, I personally am very hypermobile. I've been practicing yoga since I was 18, so that is almost 30 years on the dot. Yeah, so 30 years of yoga. And I must confess, my early yoga practice was really powerful and very strong and very Ashtanga based, and I did kind of punish my hips. And now I have to be super careful, and there are moments when I'm in pain with my hips because I have been able to push to that limit and a little bit beyond. So my rule of thumb for people with hypermobility is to consider what I call kind of gathering in a sense of gathering in rather than splaying out, and that could be equally shoulders or elbows or knees or hips or ankles. And shortly we want to get on to the question about ankles, because that potentially could be a hypermobile thing. So hypermobility is something that, we're drawn to yoga if we're hypermobile because we look really good at it. But looking really good at it is a completely, it's a fabrication, it's an illusion. And it goes back to the biopsychosocial thing. The illusion of what you look like doesn't actually have much to do with how it's felt, how it actually is embodied within you, and the psychological impact of that. So the psychological impact of being able to sit in a wonderful butterfly hips might be that you look, you feel you look great, and everyone in the room's like, wow. So all it is it's boosting this kind of sense of ego or grandeur, or it's not actually evolving the person within. It's a different question. My other absolute passion is meditation and philosophy, which is completely separate to anatomy. So that's kind of slightly going on to the philosophical and meditation kind of side of self. So let's get back to the point. Otherwise, Kat will come back as the voice from afar telling us to keep on track. Okay, so I'd like to get to, if we may, the ankle. So Jess asked a question, and I see there's a couple of other questions that have turned up, so I'm hoping we'll get to those. But Jess asked a question in advance about ankles. And this is this interesting question where both Ben and I came up with completely separate answers, which I think is interesting. So, about the ankle, she says in a wide forward fold, and we're both presuming a standing wide forward fold, Jess feels that the muscles on the outside, the lateral side of her ankles get tired. And they get tired and achy, and she's concerned that there might be something she needs to do to strengthen or adapt this wide forward fold. Okay, so Ben's answer first, and then I'll give you mine, which is opposite, but that doesn't mean either of us are right or either of us are wrong, which is slightly irritating for Jess, but we'll see. We'll see what happens.
So going back to the skeleton, if you're going to be in a wide forward fold, the leg is going to be out like this. So the ankle has to turn into this.
Oh, in the camera, it looks the other way, but obviously I'll not confuse matters.
Yeah. So this is a big toe side. So wide forward fold, unless you're going to be completely on the inner arch of your foot, you're going to have to turn your foot downwards, and that's going to potentially put quite a bit of stretch through some muscles that go down the outside of the leg area here. So this is our two leg bones here. We've got our tibia, which is our shin bone, and then we've got this smaller bone called the fibula. And so the peroneal muscles, which is a bit confusing because it's nothing to do with the perineum, but the peroneal muscles or the fibularis muscles come down the side here and then attach lower down around ankle, or one actually wraps all the way underneath the arch of the foot and helps to support the arches of the foot. But so if you're in that sort of position, it may be that you're quite tight through those perineal muscles, which is causing a bit of strain. Particularly once you're putting your body weight down through into that forward fold, it might be pushing quite significantly outwards, which is going to increase that loading through the outside of the leg. If it's very localized, just to the outside of the ankle, that might be more of a restriction in the ligament and joint capsule of the ankle joint itself. But if it's more a sense of stretch, that could be the issue.
So, and in that case, Jess, you would probably just narrow the stance a little bit. I would have thought, instead of being too wide. Again, it's back to that kind of, this aspiration to get somewhere. Where are we heading to? We actually want to not head out, we want to head in. So kind of this sense of where is my comfortable place for that wide forward fold? So the opposite side of that is I felt that potentially Jess could be hypermobile. And interestingly, the biopsychosocial model picks up instantly there, because that's what I am, is biopsychosocial. Ben's thinking about perhaps it's a little bit tightness, perhaps that's a different thing. So if, Jess, as you stand with your legs quite wide and that just about to go into the forward fold, and you feel that there's an achiness in your ankles, perhaps your ankles are having to work quite hard because you're hypermobile in the ankles. And in which case it's a similar response actually, to make sure that the arches of your feet are lifted, but not too much. You know, it's very possible for hypermobile people to really lift the arches of their feet to the point where it's kind of almost, it's too much yet again, it's going beyond all kind of anatomy. Just with those 2 points, have a think. I mean, you hopefully will know if you're hypermobile or not, and if that is the case, containment, a little bit more containment, and not going to that edge, softening a bit, even to the point where you're supinating a little bit with the feet. That might be useful. Whereas the other way, still narrowing the feet, but not pushing quite so much into that stretch with the feet.
Or working in more of that, it's like a kind of Cossack squat type position where you're squatting on the one knee and the other leg is out to the side, and then you could gradually increase the weight bearing going through that splayed out leg, just to control the amount of load, but still being able to get a bit of stretch through the outside of the ankle if that's what you need. If it's more about strengthening, I'm a big fan of wobble boards and that sort of thing, which doesn't really come into the yoga classes, but it could do in you can easily get hold of these wobble devices, wobble cushions. There's all sorts of things. Maybe some just balance work with standing on one leg and creating challenge through that, because it's going to have to then create stability through your ankle. So if it's more of an instability problem, probably working more in terms of a strength type approach. As I say, trying to create a bit of a instability challenge, in other words, balance. Whereas if it's a stretch thing, it might be worth looking at that, as I said, that kind of, I call it a Cossack squat type position. I hope you get what I mean. Not for people with sore hips, Cossack squats. No. Okay. So then we had a question about feet from Sonia, who's one of our teachers, and she very kindly asked a question about feet. And I'm really pleased we have this question, because it's a Movement for Modern Life week for us this week, because on Friday we're filming a second set of films for our anatomy series. So we can really build up all of this anatomy knowledge for you. And one of the things that we're going to be looking at, one of the things that we're going to be really looking at on Friday is particularly about feet and ankles. But we wanted to answer Sonia's question. So Sonia's talking about plantar fasciitis. And how we can help our students or ourselves if we have this condition. So again, when we had a brief discussion just about half an hour ago over a cup of tea, we both decided that the most key thing here is to explain a little bit about what this kind of condition that we call plantar fasciitis kind of is, because it's one of the group of conditions that is a little bit of a, what do you call it, a sort of bucket condition. Well, it's one of those conditions, a bit like sciatica and frozen shoulder, that people will self-diagnose quite happily with a bit of internet research, and that's understandable. They're wanting to get to the bottom of what the problem is, but it might not be plantar fasciitis. Not all painful feet is to do with plantar fasciitis. So, shall I talk a bit about the condition itself then? Yeah. Like I said, with burst. What is your plantar fascia? Well, first, okay. So just to go back to what I said about a bursa and a bursitis. So a bursitis is when the bursa is inflamed. Anything with itis on the end, as I said, means inflammation. So a plantar fasciitis suggests that your plantar fascia has become inflamed. That's quite sort of old school now in terms of its thinking, because actually it comes more under the umbrella of what we call a tendinopathy. An incomplete healing process actually, which has caused some structural degeneration inside tendons or fascia. So we might think in terms of more that it being a plantar fasciosis is one of the terms that we tend to use, because again it takes that inflammation out of the equation, because often we find that actually there isn't any inflammation. It might be very, very painful, and we might actually be able to feel swelling, but that swelling isn't down to inflammation. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox about that one. But what is our plantar fascia? So our plantar fascia is on the sole of our foot, because that is our plantar surface. So underside of the foot here, we've got attachments to the heel bone back here, and actually, again, you probably won't be able to pick up on this necessarily on this from this distance, but there's a couple of bony knobbles on the front of the heel here, and that's where your plantar fascia attaches. And then it comes forward to attach to around the ball of the foot, so the metatarsal heads. So that's at this sort of level, and it's a sheet of connective tissue or fascia that goes between those two areas. And its role is it has multiple functions, but one is to assist with maintaining both the inner arch of our foot and the outer arch of our foot. These are called our longitudinal arches, but also our transverse arch through the whole area as well. It's just creates that bit of gathering in to create that hollow under the sole of the foot. So the most common area to get pain would be on the inner side of the front of the heel. So my feet are probably going to be a bit dirty, but if I lift up my foot, it's going to be at about here. So if you've got pain anywhere else, it's unlikely to be plantar fasciitis. I'll stick with the old school name because for simplicity's sake. So what are the causes of that? Any sort of tendinopathy tends to be very common when there's been a sudden increase in load very quickly. Our connective tissues, in terms of our tendons and fascia and ligaments and joint capsules, all the things that aren't able to really contract, don't have a great blood supply. So they're not able to suddenly increase their strength very quickly because they can't get the raw materials brought there. And in here we're talking mainly about collagen, so one of the main proteins, in fact the main protein of our body. So if you suddenly decide that you're going to go off for a long hike and you're not really used to it, or you're going to start training for the marathon, or in fact you're not even going to bother training for the marathon, you're just going to do a marathon, you might well end up with overloading these tissues, and then they become a bit, as I say, degenerated in terms of the internal structure. So they're not able to actually do their job. They can't resist that the tensile loads, the pulling apart loads, so they become quite painful. But one of the other causes would be that if our calf muscles are very tight, because they attach via our Achilles tendon onto the other part of our heel, which would be, let's just get hold of it, would be down onto this part of the heel bone here.
Oh, just me.
So calf muscles coming down here, blending into the Achilles tendon, attaching to here. But just as we've got the plantar fascia, we've got a fascial covering that covers all of our bone, and that's called the periosteum. And then that will be continuous with the fascia that's around the tendon, which is then continuous with the fascia of our musculature. So if your calf muscles are very tight, you might end up causing a tractioning effect that will then be transferred to the plantar fascia. So definitely working quite a lot on, on getting our calf muscles stretched out. But also, although I'm saying you don't want to overload the plantar fascia or any other tendinopathy or fasciosis, you do want to provide some sort of challenge. We don't want to back off completely, because it's only through challenging it that the structure will rehabilitate, and definitely that's can happen. It might take a little while, so we don't want to back off completely.
Yeah, I'm just reading the question. Exactly. One of the things that I've noticed on this with feet is actually also to do with lockdown. So we have a lovely yoga studio here with a very hard wooden floor, And before COVID, we would place very kindly 2 yoga mats on top of each other for most of our clients, for most of our students, to give them a little bit of extra padding. And now, or when we could, people would come in, they would usually bring 1 mat. And also people are practicing more outside, potentially on terraces or stone floors. And I think that the hardness of the floor can also have an impact, particularly if we're doing quite impact. I mean, maybe not something quite as strong as a jump through, but quite a lot of impact through the feet. So we're very much of a, you know, we don't agree on everything, but we do agree on things like not particularly liking orthotics for feet. I know Anna mentioned a comment about inner arches. I'm a big one on playing the toes, you know, moving our toes in our practice. And moving the toes in the practice can really help with all the rest of the foot, as can more of an understanding of the Achilles. You know, most people get a very mixed message of what your Achilles tendon is and sort of think it's this tiny thing, but it's actually pretty robust inside, inserting into that calf portion. So things like downward dog are really helpful for that, and can actually, although it might feel uncomfortable for somebody with this plantar fasciitis or fasciosis, you know, can be helpful as long as they've got some better padding probably under their feet. But it is a bit of a bigger question, and we need to move on now. Sorry.
It's frustrating, there's so much to say.
There's so much to say. I'd like to get on to Vera's question. So Vera, thank you so much for your question about osteoporosis and osteopenia. I always have a problem pronouncing that. So we only have a few more minutes. We've got nearly 10 minutes, so we'll do a little bit on that, because I think that's a really important and relevant question. So, Ben.
Okay, so osteoporosis is when we have a loss of bone density. We may not even have sufficient bone density to avoid fractures. So the fractures might be sudden in terms of a fall, or there might be a collapse of the, particularly in the spine, the vertebra will tend to take on this wedge shape. So rather than having this nice sort of separation, particularly the front of the thoracic spine, so where the ribs are, will tend to collapse and give us this sort of wedge shape of to the vertebra. So osteopenia is really just a sort of precursor to that. I mean, it can be detected through testing, but you wouldn't normally pick it up on a normal X-ray, whereas osteoporosis you might actually quite easily pick it up on an X-ray. So
can I use my little analogy of the food product?
Yeah. So
Yes.
So just to point out before you do that, the inside of the bone, we think about the outside being all solid, but it's not solid all the way through. Otherwise, our bones would be very, very heavy. So our body, in terms of being efficient, has laid down this sort of honeycomb arrangement inside, and I think that's what you were going to.
Yeah, I just think it's really fascinating. You know, we see these skeletons and we think that they're solid, dense, kind of impenetrable objects, and actually the skeletons, I remember being kind of this idea of like an aero bar or a crunchy bar,
yeah.
Like a honeycomb crunchy bar and an aero bar. That is our natural bone kind of makeup, as it were, like the aero bar or the crunchy bar. But as we get towards these slightly more challenging conditions as we age, or also hormonal, it becomes a little bit more like a ciabatta. Okay, so I'm definitely one for visuals. I like a visual, and that one helps me. So the holes get bigger, it gets a little bit more vulnerable. And so then we need to find ways that we can support ourselves and feel that we can enable ourselves to not be concerned too much about that through some sort of sensible movement and sensible practice.
Because this sort of honeycomb arrangement is actually...
Sorry, somebody wants a crunchy now.
Yes, it's actually laid down along stress lines. And this is where the idea of weight-bearing exercise comes into trying to preserve our bone density. So we have two cells working in opposition. We've got our osteoblasts, so osteo meaning bone, and blasts are the ones that build bone, And then we've got our osteoclasts that are remodeling the bone all the time. But they can, if the osteoblasts aren't keeping up with the osteoclasts, then we lose bone density. So if we put stress through the body, through the skeletal system, we can encourage that osteoblast activity, so that building activity. And that's where really this idea, as I say, of and obviously yoga is one of the ways in which we can do it. I mean, it might not be the most fantastic in terms of you might be better doing some slightly more impact work in addition to your yoga for that stress line maintenance effect, as it were. But the other side of the osteoporosis is that we need the musculature to be nice and strong around these areas, because if people get quite fearful of not moving, sort of fear avoidance of in case something happens, get that sort of sense of fragility, then we're going to lose our muscular strength. So in terms of how yoga might help, we probably want to work out how bad the osteoporosis was. Was it localized to one area? This neck of the femur is a classic place. The vertebra, as I say, a classic place. Wrists are quite vulnerable, particularly in terms of falls, because we might fall onto outstretched hands and get a radial fracture, a fracture of our radius bone is what I mean. So we might want to have a sort of graded system, so that if someone has very severe osteoporosis, we might want to sort of shy away a little bit from the more challenging balances. Well, in fact, we definitely would want to shy away. But use of the yoga chair, for example, is a really good way of and a wall.
And a wall.
So,
support yourself.
Yeah.
Balance with support.
So one example was say you want to go to do downward dog for someone who's got quite advanced osteoporosis. You might do an alternative against the wall, where they've got their hands against the wall and their feet slightly further back, so they're stretching into that down dog position. Did I? Yes. I must break your wife's nose while saying it.
We're really trying to get through all the questions because we know it's really important for you, but many of these questions, quite honestly, Ben and I could probably talk about all day.
Yeah.
So you'll just have to come to our advanced anatomy course, where we have got all day to go through all the questions, but we're trying to get the key things. Yeah. There's one other question that we have had in the list that I would like to try and squeeze in before we must go. We all have to go before 7. So this question's about Chaturanga and shoulders. So if you teach Chaturanga, this will be really important. And if you practice or try and practice Chaturanga, then this is important. So this is another thing that I mentioned. I've been practicing for 30 years. Another thing that I had kind of quite an ego attachment to my Chaturanga when I was about, 20 or something. And that's changed. And we were looking at this question from Laura, who wants to hear about Chaturanga and shoulder impingement. Because we've literally got 5 minutes, we probably can't go through all the huge range of shoulder issues that could be very much triggered by Chaturanga. So we need to pick some very key kind of points for you to be aware of in terms of this. So that's a pleasure, Vera. So my first thing is, if you're a teacher, really do educate yourself about the movement of the shoulder, what the shoulder does. I mean, often we also run a teacher training program here, and some trainees might kind of think that the shoulder is just this bit, just the shoulder ball and socket. But of course, it's a girdle, like the pelvic girdle. So there's a pelvic girdle, there's a shoulder girdle. They're kind of similar and dissimilar in many ways. So educate yourself about the shoulder. Educate yourself about the alignment of the elbow in relationship to the shoulder. So in Chaturanga, if I was sort of have hands on the floor, where my elbow is will impact a lot on how my shoulder is aligned into the socket. And of course, we can start talking about things like rotator cuffs, about impingements. But the final thing, which is blatantly obvious before I hand it over to Ben, is the more weight bearing you put through that shoulder, the more challenge it's going to have. So putting your knees on the floor, no shame. Get your knees on the floor before you even try your Chaturanga. So you get the shoulders in a really good alignment. You know what your shoulders are able to and required to do before you even think about lifting the knees off the floor.
So this is quite a good point as well with teachers, and we've seen this a lot, is that suddenly you have to demonstrate something, you haven't warmed up, you prepared this lovely class where everyone's, edging their way towards a certain pose, or maybe a peak pose or something like that, and then suddenly somebody goes, I don't really understand it, and suddenly they think, well, I'll just show them, and then we need to warm up, so be kind to yourself. So, and in those examples, as I say, don't be, like Lucy said, don't be shy of saying, I'm not warmed up, I'm going to put my knees down in this Chaturanga, but you get the idea. So just to go a little bit into the anatomy in a very quick set, here's a shoulder. It's might be a little bit confusing, but if I was to place it here, it might give you a little bit more idea, because here's the collarbone coming across.
You can feel your own collarbone.
So collarbone coming across, and then we've got the ball and socket joint here. This sort of triangular shaped bone is our scapula or our shoulder blade, and the muscles of the rotator cuff are several muscles that come off our shoulder blade and round to protect the ball and socket joint. In terms of impingement, there's, again, might not be able to see it, there's a
little tiny hole.
There's a little tiny hole. So the top muscle of our rotator cuff, called supraspinatus, comes through that space and then attaches via its tendon onto the front of the ball and socket joint. So if you were to have your arm out to the side, it would tend to squash that space. And that's why we need to think in terms of that alignment. So tucking the elbows in is one of the key ways of trying to decompress that area or keep that space open. What can happen though is when we're doing Chaturanga, or a press up of any kind, to be honest, our pectoral muscles are very much involved, and they are often stronger than the other muscle involved, which is our triceps. So we tend to sort of, maybe especially when we start, go quite wide, but we have to be careful that we don't end up like this. I'm sure you know a lot of this already, but just to sort of highlight that it's that sense of going inwards, which will then become much more of a tricep-dominated movement, and maybe something we want to work towards. But as Lucy said, lots of options for using, you talked about.
There's loads of brilliant props that you can use for Chaturanga, which I could show you another time, but there's loads of really fun and interesting and supported ways to teach and practice Chaturanga with props. So for now, I would like to say I'm so grateful for so many people that we know turning up. It's just wonderful that we've seen lots of new faces, lots of known faces, but also lots of new names. We can't actually see your faces, otherwise I'd be waving sort of excitedly at you all. Just to sort of mention, we do run an advanced anatomy course. Also, Movement for Modern Life are running an amazing course on their movers on their site, which I'm sure Kat will mention. And we do run a teacher training, and both of which we're offering discounts for people who are part of the movers group. So maybe we have to do another one, Kat.
Yeah, absolutely. Guys, I've so enjoyed that. Absolutely fascinating. And as you say, each question could have been easily a good hour, a good conversation. And I know that there are so many more questions in the pipeline, so we'll have to come back for more. But I'm just so grateful to you for sharing your knowledge and your wisdom and your humor as well. So you're a great duo, and I'm so delighted to have your knowledge here and have you on the site. As you say, guys, please do check out Flow. They do some amazing anatomy courses and teach trainings. And Movement for Modern Life, as you say, is currently doing an anatomy course. But with no further ado, I really should say thank you so much to all of you, to the whole community, thank you for joining in. Thank you, Lucy and Ben, for all of your knowledge and for sharing so fully. I really appreciate that. So with much love to you all, have a very peaceful evening.
As I said earlier, confetti of kisses to you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kat. You've been a to be here today. Thank you.
Much love.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.